coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung squats deck Thargo, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I hope you are all well. And on this episode, we're going back in time once again to a bit of a classic interview from Thrillcast's past. Steve Yeowell is one of those artists who, for me, sums up 2000 AD. Such a distinctive style, somebody who has done very different work on different series. He's done everything from Devlin Waugh. You've got Zenith, obviously. He's worked on Judge Dredd, Maniac 5 from the 1990s. He even did the movie adaptation of A Life Less Ordinary, the Ewan McGregor, Cameron Diaz movie in the 90s. But the Red Seas, Black Shuck, Sinister Dexter, which he's been on most recently. Such a unique style, something that I don't think you'd really find elsewhere in comics, and certainly not with the breadth of series and time that you have at 2000 AD. So a few years ago, it was fantastic to be able to chat to him about his career and about the evolution of his style, which is so distinctive. So this episode is taking the two parts of the Steve Yeowell interview from I think 2015 and jamming them together into one nice long episode. So I hope you enjoy that. We'll be back in a week's time with a new interview, this time with artist Trevor Hairsine, who working for 2000 AD in the 90s, went on to work on Class War, and is now in really high demand as an artist. So it was wonderful to be able to nail him down and have a chat. So that will be next week. So we're going to crack on with the Steve Yeowell interview from, pretty sure it was 2015. So sit back, relax, and we'll see you in a week's time, athletes. Splundig Verthrig.
I just really wanted to kick off and start at the very beginning, because I hear it's the very best place to start. And talk a little bit about you and your background. You're originally from Essex. Let's sort of chat about comics and how you came to be involved in them in the first place.
Right. Well, like most boy children in the 60s and 70s, I kind of grew up reading comics. And I established at a reasonably young age that that's what I wanted to do. But around the age of 15, 16, I kind of stopped reading them for the same reasons that all 15 or 16-year-olds stop reading comics. And then when I was at college in Sheffield, I went to Sheffield City Polytechnic to do 3D design.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, strangely. I mean, I'm thinking at the point I did my art foundation course, because I slipped away from the comics world, and I got it into my head I was going to be a graphic designer or an illustrator or something along those lines. And we quickly established that probably wasn't really my route. And I ended up in the metalwork workshops, sort of making little, pieces of jewellery and a little bit of light product design. And I ended up doing 3D design at Sheffield City Polytechnic. But it was while I was there, I started picking up comics again. First, Epic Illustrated,
right?
Maybe even heavy metal, but I can't quite remember. And then I quickly found that I didn't really enjoy I don't know what you would call that, but those particular publications. They're not really the alternative press, are they? Anyway, I found I probably preferred the mainstream to the kind of material that you got in epic and heavy metal.
Yeah.
I'd been keeping an eye out still on what 2000 AD were doing, because my brother was, he's 4 years younger than me, was was still buying 2000 AD at the time. So although I didn't purchase them myself, I saw all those classic Dave Gibbons Rogue Troopers and Judge Death Lives, which has probably been my all-time favourite Dread story, actually.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, and so by the time I was wrapping up my 3-year degree, I'd kind of decided that I didn't really want to be a metalworker or a silversmith or a jeweler.
Right.
And I was interested enough in the comics again to think, well, you know, I'm going to give this a go. I'm really into this. I'm going to try and get back into the comics.
Right.
And I drew a strip for a small press publication called Totally Alien. I met the chaps that were publishing that through a mutual friend who I'd made whilst at college. And it was sending stuff around from Totally Alien and meeting David Lloyd and Mike Collins, Mark Farmer, through joining the Society of Strip Illustration, which has now become the Comics Creators Guild, I believe. If it still exists, I'm not entirely sure. That I got work on Martin Locke's Swiftsure title. If you remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, Mike.
Not quite old enough to remember.
You don't remember the Harrier titles?
No, I don't actually.
Don't remember Harrier comics?
No. Explain a bit more about those for those like me who don't know them.
Yeah, I think Martin Locke had been writing and producing a strip. The title of which escapes me, but it was kind of loosely based on Star Trek. A friend of Brian Bullen's called Dave Harwood was drawing it and designing it. But anyway, Martin eventually started a line of small press comics, and he expanded on this universe he created within those pages. And there was a regular character called Lieutenant Fluff, spelled FL''F.
Right.
It was a kind of female Vulcan kind of a figure. And anyway, Mike Collins and Mark Farmer were drawing a short story featuring her, which they couldn't complete, and I took over from them.
Right.
Yes, and I'm trying to get my chronology right now. Now we've started talking about it, it feels like a lifetime ago. But from there, I believe I was working on. I got to work on a dummy comic David Lloyd was producing for Fleetway called Fantastic Adventure.
Yeah.
Which was my first meeting with Grant. He was writing the strip I was down to draw called California Crew. David's big idea was that this Fantastic Adventure was going to, the stories within it were going to be based on the TV series that were popular at the time.
Yeah.
TV series and movies that were popular at the time. So there was a character called Johnny O'Hara that Grant was writing and John Burns was drawing, which was a kind of Indiana Jones figure.
Yeah.
And California Crew were loosely based on the A-Team. So anyway, that didn't go anywhere.
Right.
But John Higgins, who was still coloring. He was coloring Watchmen at the time. Saw some of my work, and he needed a hand helping out to finish a half-page comic strip he was writing and drawing for a music magazine. I think, if I remember correctly, it was called The Street or The Street Scene, something like that. And for various reasons, he had slipped behind with the schedule. So myself and another friend of his helped out drawing and colouring it. I did the drawing, and his colleague coloured it. And yeah, what happened then? Yeah. That's it. And John was also on good terms with the chaps from Marvel UK, and I'd sent some Zoid samples into them. and the subject came up during one of their nights out. And John said, "Well, I've worked with Steve. Why don't we do something together? Do a cover together for you?" And they were up for that idea. But that fell through. But I got a cover anyway.
Right.
For Spider-Man Zoids. The cover featured Spider-Man in a black costume, and Starbrand, and Hela, who was the lead character in Zoids. From that, I got a fill-in on the strip. And then when Kev Hopgood moved on to Action Force, I got offered the strip full-time.
Right.
Grant was writing Zoids at the time. And I think he was pitching Zenith to 2000 AD around then at the same time. And to sort of cut a long story short, I suppose the rest is history.
End of podcast. There we go. Well, let's. I mean, like you say, you've covered an awful lot there, but let's kind of go back. So you'd gone from doing metalwork and 3D design and things like that to hanging out with these guys as part of the what would become Comic Creators Guild.
Yeah.
Things were different back then, weren't they? Because you didn't have the massive proliferation of conventions. You didn't have the convention circuit as we have now. So the opportunities to meet guys like John Higgins and Mark Farmer and Mike Collins were not less, but were different. So rather than go to conventions and see them and talk to them while they're busy sketching at tables and whatnot and doing panels. You're going to meetings with these guys and hanging out with them as as somebody who wants to work in the industry. That's almost a kind of a trade union way of doing things.
Meetings. That kind of sounds very formal. It was the SSI, and the average meeting of the SSI was that there'd be a talk by someone. Some kind of comics related kind of a talk by someone producing something. A lot of it was just chatting in the bar, really, and doing the kinds of things you do at conventions, really, just showing your latest work and talking about your latest work and just generally networking. I suppose that was the networking opportunity back then. I mean, and the other way to meet people was to go along to the regular comic marts they had at Westminster Hall every 2 or 3 months. There was a pub around the corner from there called, I think it was called the Westminster Arms, where everyone used to hang out, and you'd go in there, and Alan Moore would be there, and Dave Gibbons would be there, and Mike and Mark would be there. And it was surprisingly easy to go and chat with them. Usually, buying them a drink helped.
It always helps. That has never changed in comics.
But that was very much the networking avenue you had back then.
And your decision to pursue a career drawing comics. Was that sparked by anything in particular, or was it just a general feeling of coming to the end of your course and thinking, well, what do I want to do? I mean, had you been drawing much as part of your course?
The kind of formal drawing you do as part of that course.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of formal life drawing. And the kind of presentation pieces you'd have to draw when you're putting together a proposal for a project. But it was, funny enough, I sort of slipped away from that habit of drawing as well. And it was only when I started reading the comics again that I started drawing for my own pleasure.
Right.
Which I guess kind of must tell you something, mustn't it? Really.
and what kind of things were you drawing at the time?
Oh God, I blush to think of it. Just kind of general caricature-y kind of stuff that you do as a student, based on people you're doing the course with. It doesn't bear repeating.
But I find it fascinating that you were more inspired by what we would consider the mainstream than I've done lots of interviews over the years with artists and things like Epic and heavy metal are referenced. People say, you discovered what comics could do with all this fully painted Frazetta stuff and all this, that and the other. But it's interesting to hear that actually the idea, the ethos, the artwork of quote unquote mainstream comics appeal to you more than that?
Yeah, that is interesting. I don't quite know why that is. I mean, but I can remember when I was younger, I was always drawn more to the kind of black and white titles than the fully painted titles. You know, I mean, there was fully painted artwork in Look and Learn. Don Lawrence was painting Trigon Empire.
Yeah.
I think Bellamy was on Garth by then, so I can't remember if I ever saw any of his Thunderbirds work. But there was the very end of those Jerry Anderson Century 1021 tie-ins. The very last days of TV 21, Joe 90, Countdown, with all that John Burns painted art, which wasn't really. It's painted black and white artwork, John Burns, isn't it? It's rather than that fully rendered gouache painting that Don Lawrence does. But I was always drawn back for some reason to like DC Thompson titles and the monthly war comics, in black and white, and American comics as well. But back in those days, I never picked up an American comic regularly because I don't think I could bring myself to wait a whole month for the next issue to come out. I used to like it every week. I used to like a fix every week.
Yeah.
But I used to get American titles through, remember these, second-hand comic stalls at the market, where you could buy second-hand comics cheap, or you could trade your old comics in for more comics.
Halcyon days.
Halcyon days.
And once you kind of so I mean, it's actually a way that when we attend conventions and we do panels about breaking into the industry, people say, how do I do it? Do I do it through the submissions pile? Do I do it through this? And one of the ways is we always recommend getting to know people in the industry.
Yeah,
and it just sounds like that. It's a classic right place, right time, right person situation.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I suppose the only real lesson you can draw from these things is to just keep working.
Yeah.
And they say you make your own luck, don't you? You just got to keep working and do that. Attend the conventions and talk to people and try and get your stuff out there. The prescribed route when I started was to work in the fanzines, and then to work in the fanzines could lead to some sort of low-paying small press stuff, and the low-paying small press stuff hopefully could lead to bigger paying stuff at Marvel or Fleetway.
Yeah.
But I guess the similar route now is through online publishing and the small press. I mean, the small press now compared to what it was back then is multiplied many times over.
Yeah.
I mean, you only have to go to Thought Bubble.
Well, I was about to say Thought Bubble fill an entire hall full of small press stuff. So it's certainly the best way. I mean, at the time, what was the atmosphere like in comics? Because historically, you had Watchmen that was about to make this massive impact on our industry. You had the beginning of the phase of the end of British comics as we knew them, and Marvel UK were not that anybody particularly knew it, but were slowly winding towards their demise. What was it like? What was the atmosphere like for you as a young artist, as a young man in comics?
It was very exciting. I mean, the avenues just kind of seemed to have opened out at that time, and the kind of work that people were going to be able to produce the horizons seemed to be opening out. Because I saw Bill Sienkiewicz he was wrapping up New Mutants, and he was getting more and more experimental, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Producing Stray Toasters, the Elektra graphic novel he drew with Frank Miller, and things were getting more and more experimental. It was a very upbeat exciting time.
And I find it interesting that your first kind of professional comics work was on a licensed comic, which many people would turn their nose up at these days. But I mean, I remember reading Spider-Man and Zoids with the odd little dose of Action Force or Hercules, whatever, thrown into the back. What was it like working on a weekly title for the first time?
Well, grueling, because obviously it's weekly deadlines.
Yeah.
You know, it's very much, you do feel like you're thrown in at the deep end when you've got your first series of deadlines. So it was long days, but as you know, got the work in, bludgeoned my way through it, and so yeah. I mean, I never had any problem working on licensed titles. What you have to remember is that the most revered British comics of the 1960s was a licensed title, effectively.
Yeah,
I mean, TV21.
Yeah, absolutely. And nobody could possibly have known it at the time, but you work with Grant Morrison, who's gone on to huge things since. What was your first interaction like? Was it did you get to know one another, or was it a case of scripts turning up in the post and just getting them done?
It was, well, obviously the first script of his I ever saw was for Fantastic Adventure.
Yeah,
as I explained earlier. Getting to know him, it was mostly through letter back then, because even when you phoned Glasgow, it's like phoning the moon. From Essex, you forget just how bad the telephone system was back then. So most of our correspondence was through letter, but there was we seemed to strike it off sort of quite easily. Seemed to have an interest in similar things musically, I think. So he was obviously far more interested in magic than I ever was. But yeah, we just seemed to strike a chord.
And how did that relationship develop? Was it a friendship that ran alongside a professional relationship, or you know, how did you come to essentially be so have careers that were intertwined for quite a substantial period of time?
I guess it was just like I say, we just sort of got on. He was always very happy to leave me to get on with the scripts. I don't think he ever asked for any changes from myself.
Right.
And you obviously just developed a friendship through going to conventions and whatever, and the network of signings which you end up doing through these projects.
Yeah. Because
what can I say? You do strike up this sort of quite a close relationship with writers.
Yeah.
Through a collaborative medium like comics.
Because there's a wonderful quote in David Bishop's Thrill Power Overload book where Grant describes realizing that you could be his Alan Davis.
That was very kind of him.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to see in hindsight that, you know, you were both part of that kind of new generation of creators that were coming through in 2000 AD in the kind of post Prog 500 phase, which was essentially the new direction for 2000 AD. You know, the old guard were flitting off to America and to other projects. Did you get a sense of being the new guard?
I think so, yeah, because I mean, Dave had left 2000 AD by then. Kev he'd drawn Metalzoic. I can't remember. Oh, he'd drawn Metalzoic and he'd done little bits and pieces for Green Lantern, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they'd started martial law by that point. And yeah, Brian had left 2000 AD a little while before that, hadn't he, to draw Camelot 3000 for DC. So yeah, there was a real sense of us being, having been given the keys to the family saloon.
And on the topic of Zoids, which is a comic that was close to my heart when I was a kid. What were the challenges of not just being a new artist, but working on something? I assume there was a style book, a way that you had to draw these toys, basically.
There wasn't a style book for the toys. There was a style book for the cast,
right?
As in the human cast.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Which was, I think it was pretty much, it was clippings from a lot of Kev's early work on the strip, which I guess had pretty much established the look of the characters. But as for the Zoids themselves, the office had a collection of the models, and we used to post them around to each other. You get this big box of Japanese robots will come through the postman would put them to your door. I used to have them sitting on the shelves next to my drawing table, Zoidzilla and I can't remember the name of the big pterodactyl character. Was it Zark?
God knows.
Yeah. But yeah, it was great just having the toys come to your door.
And how long did you work on Zoids for?
Maybe 8 months,
Right.
months to a year.
Okay.
The last thing I drew there was a plan to produce it as a 22 or 24 page American style comic book, and then Marvel US would sell it. And I penciled the whole first issue, and it was partially inked. And then I think the whole project was put on hold because there was a particular approach that Marvel wanted. And for whatever reason, the project was put on hold. But it was at that point, actually, that I started, I got the word about Zenith from Steve Mack at 2000 AD. So I moved on to Pastures New.
Okay. Well, never a better time to talk about Zenith, really, which I mean, we describe as your breakthrough work, but it kind of, it's more than that, really, isn't it? It's one of those strips that comes along every so often. I think every kind of phase of 2000 AD, if any comic book has a story that not only defines it but sets the future in motion. It's kind of like a mission statement. This is the direction that we're going to go in, and certainly it felt. I mean, I came into reading Zenith much later, but even then, it felt like a real kind of breath of fresh air. What was the first word you had on it? Was it something that Steve said, or had Grant discussed it at all, or how did you come to know about it?
Yeah, I didn't know anything about it until Steve Mack got in touch with me.
Okay.
Because he and Grant and Brendan had pretty much hammered out the synopsis for the first series. Brendan's character designs had been nailed. But he wasn't able to commit to drawing the series. And I think on the back of my having drawn, firstly, that Future Shock for Steve, so he was familiar with my work.
Yeah.
And having worked with Grant on Zoids, so he was familiar with my work. Steve got in touch, and I think his words pretty much were, we have a project you might be interested in. Would you like to take a look? And well, it was frankly, it was a no-brainer once I'd got the, once the background material came through the post. I mean, I knew I had to draw it. It was like every exciting strip that was being published at that time rolled into one. It was Watchmen, it was Crisis on Infinite Earths, it was everything.
Describe this background material that you got through the post.
I got Grant's plot synopsis for the first series, and then there was additional material that had gone backwards and forwards between him and Steve, discussing and altering a few aspects. And I got Brendan's character designs for Zenith, Peter St. John, Spook. No, Grant designed Ruby. Anyway, yeah, and Grant had done designs for Red Dragon, Voltage, Lux, and basically I was sent everything that's seen reprint in the back of the first volume of the recent Rebellion reprint.
Right. And what was your feeling about it? What was your impression as soon as you'd absorbed this material?
It was just really exciting. I mean, I hadn't seen anything like it before. And obviously Brendan's designs are pretty unique.
Yeah.
And I kind of loved all that introducing all those kind of 1960s music elements as well.
Because there's a quote from Grant again in Thrill Power Overload, where he talks about your work having pop realism, and the whole of Zenith is run through with all the not just pop culture references, but with sensibilities as well. And how do you feel your artwork brought out that kind of shared idea that shared passion for things like pop and pop culture that you and Grant had?
Yeah, I think it's with my style referencing those classic 1960s comic styles, and you can see that kind of work, that kind of style repeated in most of the pop culture images of the 1960s. You know, from I can remember seeing bands projecting images of the Mighty Thor, probably against copyright. You know, in the early 80s, you know, you think of Roy Lichtenstein referencing all those comics panels that he did, and I think, I mean, perhaps I was even a bit old-fashioned by the early 80s, you know, but late 80s, I beg your pardon, with drawing material like that. But yeah, and maybe it was the Alan Davis influence as well, because obviously there's a huge 1960s Gil Kane, Frank Bellamy influence in Alan's work. So it's the total of all those things. If that makes sense.
It seems particularly on something like Zenith that you have, and this is going to sound maddeningly vague, a quintessentially British comics style in that it has, you know, it evokes those creators of the 1960s that we've already touched on, but also it has a looseness, a vigor. You are not afraid to play around with perspective and viewpoint. You know, for all of the kind of forced perspective, a lot of old school American comics, the camera, as it were, always seems almost very fixed. You know, you have a set number of viewpoints, whereas particularly with Zenith, but also as your work has gone on, it just seems that there's always a fresh angle to take. There's always something, you know, a new way of looking at a scene, and that for me makes it perfect for British comics.
Well, firstly, thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, you're very kind. Where that kind of approach comes from, I couldn't say. I guess, you know, we're all the sum total of all the things we've read and all the films we've watched, all the music we've listened to, aren't we? I wouldn't like to say that my approach is particularly original. There must be all sorts of influences in there somewhere that are finding their way out. But yeah, I quintessentially British. Yeah, I think that would be fair to say.
But I mean, you say, you know, it's not necessarily original, but I think what defines an awful lot of 2000 AD artists, yourself included, is that you take all those influences and make something new out of it. You know, yes, you're an amalgam of all those things in that are part of us all, but you know, nobody draws like Steve Yeowell. Nobody draws like Jock or Fraser Irving or Dave Gibbons. You know, you look at your work, you look at other 2000 AD artists' work, and it's immediately recognisable in a way that an awful lot of artwork I don't think is.
Yeah, well, thank you again. Yeah. I mean, I can remember just going back to my design education days. I mean, the way you went about designing anything was to look at what was already out there on the market and kind of take the things that you liked, but then add your own little twist and push it on further.
Yeah.
So I guess really we're all doing that subconsciously. You know, when it comes to comics artwork, when it comes to writing, I think that's what everyone's doing.
It's interesting because that echoes a quote from Steve McManus that I read, which is Zenith was very much in the classic 2000 AD vein, characters with weird aspects. So you know, the things that you expect but twisted ever so slightly to make them different and unusual, and certainly Zenith was that, wasn't it? It was the standard kind of superhero tropes, but through a twisted prism.
Yeah, it's the standard superhero tropes, but given a British slant.
Absolutely, yeah. And with that phase one, and we'll come on to talk about what the Apex edition reveals about phase one. One of the things I love about it is that it is this wonderful harking back to British war comics and in many ways the obsession with the Second World War that British comics had for the best part of 30 years. Because you have this Nazi super soldier and his British counterpart and you know, the impact that has on the present, and it's a wonderful kind of beginning of the story that Grant and yourself are grounding it in a past that everybody in Britain recognises as fundamentally part of our national psyche.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Obviously, Grant's as grounded in DC Thompson War comics as
exactly. But then, you know, kind of saying, well, what impact does this have on the 1980s? What impact does this have on modern Britain? You know, ultimately, it's a destructive one. Yeah.
Well, you hit the nail on the head there.
Damn it! I just kind of wanted to get your feeling about that first phase and how it developed and how you as an artist changed and adapted over the course of those pages.
Well, what I liked about phase one structurally was the way it kind of gradually built on the tension. Episode after episode, until we're introduced to Zenith in the early episodes, and then we're introduced to Maximan and the plot with the Loigor and the Brotherhood of the Black Sun. I probably got that group name wrong. And then he kind of gradually racks up the tension over the subsequent episodes until we have the big fight scene at the end. It was a classic piece of tight structural writing. In fact, the way I approached thumbnailing out those episodes was part of my ritual was to sit down with the script and play some cinematic background music, which is something I read Frank Bellamy used to do when he was illustrating. He'd put on mood music to get him into the right place for doing all that atmospheric double lit illustration. I seem to remember I was playing the soundtrack for A Nightmare on Elm Street quite a lot.
Okay. Yeah, I can kind of see that. Yeah.
Well, you'd be surprised how it works.
Yeah.
The episodes leading up to the storm building and Maximan having the fight with Ruby in London, and then finishing off poor old Chadwell. I can't look back at those pages without thinking of that music.
Right. Brilliant. And when you got to the end of phase one, this was your first major work.
Yeah.
You know, where you are co-creator, and you know this is something that isn't just complete in of itself; it's going to continue. Did you kind of sit back and take stock?
Oh well, I had a few weeks off. I guess you could call that sitting back and taking stock. Yeah. Well, actually, it wasn't long before we started gathering background material for the second series. I was out within a couple of weeks of finishing the first series. I was out buying background material on the Futurists. To get the feeling for those futurist cityscapes that appeared in the prologue. Right.
Yeah. And so I presume your involvement in phase two was much heavier in terms of the background stuff than it had been for phase one, where Brendan had done a lot of the kind of visual stuff.
Yes, there was more design work that was my responsibility. So I restyled Zenith's costume for that phase and subsequent phases. I think the idea always was that his costume was going to change all the time, and I based his studded jacket on something similar that George Michael was wearing in the Faith video at the time.
Right.
And the earring. I had much more responsibility, much more design responsibility for that series and on.
Let's talk about Zenith as a character for a moment. Did you ever get the feeling that he was a cipher for Grant, or was he an amalgam of all the influences, all the satire that is at the heart of Zenith?
I think he's an amalgam of all the satire and influences at the heart of Zenith and Grant.
Right.
He always brings something of himself into his work. I mean, in everything he's ever done.
Yeah.
Zenith, Sebastiano, Invisibles. There's all bits of Grant in there.
Mm-hmm. And did when you were working on that first phase, was it easy to kind of pour maybe your own feelings about pop music and everything into that satire, because he is a most venal, self-obsessed, shallow creature, which is a message that has echoed all the way down through the history of pop music. Is that these pop stars are just children. Was it easy to kind of pour your own feelings about pop culture into the way that you portrayed them?
I think so. It wasn't. I wouldn't say it was as considered as it might sound, but I mean, I guess all my feelings about pop culture found their way through the pen subconsciously somehow.
And that does lead me naturally onto the conclusion. What were your feelings about pop culture in the mid-80s?
I'm not sure I can remember it now, Mike. It was like so long ago. Sort of pop culture back in the 80s and indeed the 70s. In those halcyon days of Top of the Pops. I mean, a lot of us used to watch Top of the Pops just so we could pause school on it. So it's like even the stuff you hated, you love really, because you loved hating it. If you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And what were your musical influences at the time? What was the stuff you liked listening to?
Oh, I think I was listening to the Smiths at the time.
Right.
It was all the stuff that everyone was listening to in the 80s, I think. And the Smiths and the Cure. But I've kind of always been, I'd like to think I've always been quite all-embracing in my musical tastes. So I was listening to purely on the basis that I know Brendan was Brendan and Pete and Brett Ewings were big Roxy Music fans. And I was playing a lot of early Roxy music at the time I was drawing Zenith, and then bits and pieces of classical and whatever. I mean, the kind of sort of heavy metal bands I used to listen to in my youth. You always revisit those things, don't you? Just so you can have a bit of nostalgic toe curling.
Yeah. 2000 AD for those first sort of 10 years or so really was a pop culture comic, because even harking back to the very first episode of Nemesis the Warlock, where even the cover is done up like a kind of album cover, and you've got Kenny Everett as a as a termite DJ, but then you go all the way through to Zenith, and then you just mentioned them there, Pete Milligan and Brett Ewins with Deadline, which was essentially a music magazine with comics. Zenith kind of sits in that spectrum of 2000 AD being influenced by more than just comics.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there was it was increasingly apparent, just the number of people from the music industry that read 2000 AD. I know. I'm pretty sure Lemmy was pictured with a copy of 2000.
Yes,
whether it's just
he
for
was.
publicity purposes or not, I don't know. I know Robert Smith, I think, was a fan. There was a band with someone made up who looked very like the Joker in it that used to. I think they used to advertise in 2000 AD. And for the life of me, I can't remember who they were. Oh, was it Alien Sex Fiend?
I don't know.
Yes, I'm sure they used to advertise in 2000 AD.
Okay.
Yeah, but of course, Pete and Brendan and Brett had actually worked for what used to be called the Inkies, the weekly music papers.
Oh yes, yeah.
In fact, Alan Moore used to write a comic strip for Sounds, didn't he? The Stars My Degradation, and there was a strip previous to that, a kind of film noir gumshoe parody, the name of which escapes me. So there's always been this strange, and I do remember Sounds having an article about Warrior when it first came out,
right?
Because Axel Press Button in a kind of earlier version appeared in the Stars My Degradation.
Oh, really? Oh,
with the blessed Steve Moore, I imagine. He's like if you imagine his cyborg body was slightly different.
Yeah.
But it was probably a testing ground for Press Button.
Right. Brilliant. I'm gonna, I've got a copy of the Apex edition in here with me. I'm going to take it out of its box because it is a wonder to behold. Really, tell us a little bit about how this came about.
Right. I think he was just in conversation with Ben and Keith. And is it Simon?
Yes,
Is the designer of the graphic novels? Yeah. Just in conversation that the matter of what artwork still existed for Zenith. And I said I still had the whole of the first phase and big chunks of the second and third phases. Some of the pages of some of the pages of which have gone. And yeah, I think they'd obviously been looking at the artist editions that IDW have been publishing. Yeah. And I guess perhaps because I have the artwork, I mean, a lot of 2000 AD artwork has gone now.
Yes, Cast of the Four Winds.
Yes, sold and resold over the years. Yeah. And it's, again, right place, right time. I still have all the artwork for the first phase.
I mean, that's quite remarkable because, like, as you say, most 2000 AD artwork has been sold on multiple times, particularly of key moments in its history. Why did you keep hold of the whole of Phase 1?
Who can say? I just couldn't bear to be parted with it.
Right. It's interesting here. One of the nice things about the Apex edition, which for our listeners is available through the 2000 AD store, but also from Diamond distributed retailer comic shops. It's at what I suppose you would call life size as it was done. But there's a note at the top of one of the pages that said that the second episode was actually the first that you drew. And you drew it 50% bigger than it was printed, but that was a little too big for you to handle comfortably.
Well, it's standard practice to draw the artwork 50% up on printed size. That's the universal approach through the comics industry in Britain and the US. I mean, US comics back in the day used to be drawn twice up. And I think they changed to 50% up sometime in the mid to late 1960s.
Yeah.
So I just took the accepted route with that first episode, first episode I drew.
Yeah.
And which I got the wrong script just as a mix up in the office. It's only, I was none the wiser. It's only when I got to the end I kind of realised there was a reference to something that had come before, that's how we discovered that I'd drawn the episode one before the prologue.
Right.
But I'd also read that Frank Bellamy used to draw only about 25% up on his Thunderbirds, the printed pages for Thunderbirds. And he preferred working that way because it meant that an editor looking at the original artwork would have a far better idea of how the printed artwork would look.
Right.
And that seemed just a much more comfortable size to be working. So I think it's about 30% bigger than printed size.
Yeah, that's what the note says.
Yeah. I mean, I talked it over with Richard, and again, back in those days, we weren't limited by the scanning machines the reprographics departments might have, because everything was, I can't remember the correct technical term, but everything's effectively photographed.
Yeah.
So you could draw whatever size you wanted, and I can remember seeing some painted covers. Again, the artist escapes me, but there's a later on there's an oil painting of Mean Machine that someone did as a cover. I'd recognise it instantly if I saw it. I just can't remember who painted it. But
could it have been Richard Dolan?
Might have been.
Yeah, fully painted Mean Machine. Yeah.
Yeah, that was twice. That was twice up. That was 100% up on printed size, and which made it look huge. And then there was a mid phase when everyone started using digital reprographics techniques, where the artwork had to be a set size because it had to wrap around a drum to go on a laser separator.
Right.
So which meant that we couldn't draw any bigger than A3.
Right.
But now, of course, we're scanning our own material. I mean, in theory, we're back to being able to draw whatever size we want, subject to the how much work you want to make yourself.
Right.
Scanning. I know Chris Weston's gone. Chris draws twice up now. His roughs are 50% bigger than printed size, and his full size artwork is 100% bigger than printed size.
You see, that way madness lies, I think. Well, I think one of the things that something like this, and it's the same with a lot of the artist editions, but it's nice to see it on something like Zenith, is just how nuts and bolts the process used to be. Now that everything's digital, it can in many ways lose a little bit of personality. But the fact, so on episode 5 of Phase 1, we've got this lovely big picture of Peter St. John, and though is it Peter St. John or Peter St. John?
I always said St. John.
Right. Okay. I've heard people say both.
I guess both are acceptable.
Yeah. On this, there's a little note at the top saying, first few episodes, I'd send a note with the art as to where I thought the logo might go on the page. Later, Richard Burton, who's the editor at the time, trusted me enough to send a batch of logos for me to paste up myself. Just the concept of an artist pasting up logos and stuff onto their artwork is just so wonderfully sort of, you know, old school and lo-fi. It really, I feel kind of brings this artwork alive a lot more than
that's true of all the, as you said, it's true of all the artist suggestions, isn't it? It's just it's nice being able to see the blue pencil and the whiteout, and the notes in the margins. Yeah, what you don't get, of course, is the smell of the spray mount when you did that pasting up. Maybe, you had to make sure you had plenty of ventilation.
Maybe we should do a little sachet of smell for any future ones.
A non-toxic one.
There's one note that I did want to ask you about, which was very early on, which the "Nuke the Whippet" slogan on Zenith's T-shirt. It says, "Grant has never adequately explained the slogan." Was this just something that was in the script and without any kind of extra explanation going on?
Yeah, literally, that's all it was. If I remember rightly, in the panel description, it asked for Zenith to be wearing a T-shirt which reads "Nuke the Whippet," and in brackets it said "Don't ask." That's all I've ever known.
That sounds either like a special message or a bet, one way or the other. But what I mean, this stuff has been sitting at the bottom of your wardrobe for all these years. What's it like seeing it in the flesh again? You know, just kind of, I don't know, brought back to life.
Yeah, it's like seeing an old friend. An old friend you have to treat very carefully because those word balloons are getting quite fragile. So yeah, it's always nice. I mean, to say that it was sitting in the bottom of my wardrobe is a little exaggeration. It's been sitting in a cupboard in my workroom.
Right. Okay.
I wouldn't. I treated it rather more respectfully than that. But yeah, it's like getting out. It's meeting an old friend again every time you sort through the cupboards.
Yeah. I mean, what's really striking about it is how accomplished your line work is, your brushwork. For somebody who'd not really been working in comics that long, to go into a series like this and have such a mastery of brushwork, is this just the result of lots and lots of practice, or is this just what came naturally to you?
Well, the vain side of me would like to say it's what came naturally to me. I think the reality is that working in comics is a real sharp learning curve because of the volume of material you have to produce, and you do learn very, very quickly.
Yeah, and it's I think certainly in the context of the later phases, this also feels a lot more detailed. The backgrounds, especially, seem like you've put so much work into them. Were you sort of conscious of trying to impress, of making a good impression on not just the editorial staff, but also on the people who are going to be reading this?
Well, I wanted to bring the best to the project because it was such a good script. I think it just drove me on. To those lengths. That sounds like the wrong word, doesn't it? It made sure I stayed nailed to the drawing board.
Right. Just looking through it now, one of the things I hadn't realised was that one of the rare colour pages in Phase 1 was by Annie Parkhouse. I didn't realise that she coloured as well as having been one of our longest serving lettering droids.
Yes, I'm not sure how much of 2000 AD she'd coloured in the past, but certainly Richard told me that she was colouring those particular pages. The colourist later on in Phase 4 was Gina Hart, who became a mainstay of 2000 AD. And I mean, just on the point about lettering, I mean, you got Mark King's really
just so accomplished lettering on this, but the sound effects especially are just. I mean that I'll flick to it now. Where is it? It's the image where Zenith gets punched through. Where is it? I'll find it in a second. Gets punched through Big Ben, and you've got that amazing thwack going across the top of the panel. How much as an artist do you feel the lettering on something like Zenith and seeing it in the Apex edition adds to the atmosphere and the storytelling of a script?
Well, the lettering generally always brings the comics pages to life. But it was Mark King was one of Gordon Robson's pen names.
I see.
But yeah, he did fabulous sound effects lettering, and it's a very integral part to the look of the strip.
And there's, we've got a little bit of stuff at the back, character designs and things like that. I mean, you've used the word nostalgia, but also you did the covers for the new hardback editions of phases 1 to 4.
Yeah.
What was it like revisiting this old friend?
It was a great experience. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah. It was like. Well, I'm sorry to use the old friends analogy again, but it's like it's just like chatting over old times with your mates.
Yeah.
Weren't comics great back then?
Yeah. And I mean, you've already mentioned this, but there's that thing about wanting Zenith as a character to change over time, and I know that Grant and yourself have commented about how he has grown as you have got older. What's your feeling about how the character morphed and adapted and changed over the course of those 4 phases?
I think he found himself very much kind of not. He found himself to be not so much a bit player, but I think he kind of realised that his was going to have to be a team contribution to resolving the conflict with the Loigor, rather than, or at least he realised it was going to have to be a team contribution when it suited him. I mean, he very quickly goes back to being the selfish, egocentric pop star at the end of every story. But I'd like to think he kind of grew a bit as a personality over the course of those 4 phases. He's a little more mature at the end. Yeah.
And what about you in terms of your style, but also your career? What was the contrast between the Steve Yeowell who went into Zenith, who got that word from Steve McManus saying there's a strip that we think you should be involved in, to the final episode?
The final episode of Zenith, or the final episode of anything?
Final episode of Zenith.
Of Zenith. I'd like to think that I'd kind of settled down into being reliable and professional. I still have the same enthusiasm for every script I'm given. It's that first rush of enthusiasm you get with a comic script. I mean, I haven't lost that from that very first episode of Zenith.
Yeah.
So maybe I haven't changed. apart from the fact my eyesight's a lot worse. And like I say, you've got the bad back, the bad eyesight. I'm different in that way.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be remiss of me not to talk about the slight limbo that Zenith has been in over a number of years, and finally, we're very pleased to be able to bring it to a public perhaps not as au fait with it as we are. What was it like as the artist to finally see it back in print?
It's great just to see it back in a format, a widely available format that hopefully everyone can read and enjoy.
Yeah. And I mean, is this something that I mean, you know, we're going to continue talking about your career beyond Zenith, but do you see Zenith as being career defining?
I think you're probably right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can never entirely escape's the wrong word, but people are always very kind about that piece of work that they remember. You know, they remember fondly, and that for me is Zenith.
What was the effect of Zenith on your career? Were there a lot of people kind of suddenly making inquiries, particularly as Grant's career has gone on to other things?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say there was some American work that came out of my drawing Zenith. But obviously, with it being as high a profile project as it was, it brings you to other people's attention, and other things. You know, other doors open because of it.
I mean, despite that, you've spent most of your career at 2000 AD. Is there a reason for that?
Well, less money, more freedom.
Right.
is the short answer. Yeah, I've always been quite happy shunting between British comics and American comics. Whenever people want me. Yeah, like you say, most of my work has been for 2000 AD. These last few years, I guess it's just written in the stars, isn't it? This kind of stuff, this kind of thing.
and I mean, we mentioned last week about how much more British your work is compared to so many others working in comics at the moment. How do you feel you fit into comics now? What is your place in the industry?
I'd like to think I'm flexible enough as an artist to be able to take on most projects that are thrown to me. I'm guessing in a lot of respects, my artwork sort of sits between styles anyway. Yeah, and I never really had, when I was working for Vertigo, I don't think I ever really had a Vertigo style.
Yeah.
And in some respects, I'm not sure. Do I have a 2000 AD style, do you think?
I'd describe it as 2000 AD style.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for that.
It's more just that, like I said in the last episode, you when I look at your work, I can't identify it as being anybody else's. It is a unique style, and I think that's one of the defining characteristics of working at 2000 AD.
Yeah.
We pick the people who are different, who are unusual, and they may well have an influence on 2000 AD down the line. On American comics down the line, but when they first come in, you've got yourself, you've got Bisley. I mentioned people like Jock and Fraser Irving. They're fresh and unusual and interesting and different, and I think that's probably the why I think something like Zenith especially stands the test of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, that's very kind of you. But you're right. I mean, 2000 is a broad church, and it embraces many styles, and long may it continue to do so.
Yeah. I mean, we'll come on to some of your other work for 2000 AD and also for America in a second. Let's talk about your influences a bit more, because you made a comment about an influence of Disney.
Yeah.
Explain a bit more about that.
Well, I guess I'm just influenced by that classic Disney school of animation. I mean, the exact names of the artists involved, passed me by. But there's it's the Disney that existed before. Let's see. I'm trying to think of what the last. I mean, the kind of things I used to see at the cinema as a child were like 101 Dalmatians and Aristocats and and Sleeping Beauty and because obviously Disney films, they were back in the day, they were released on a 7-year cycle, was it? I think.
Yeah.
I know there was a regular cycle they used to re-release them on, and it's just that school of realistic cartooning, in the sense that the kind of proportions of the figures are fair, convincing rather than realistic. I mean, it's never entirely realistic. That school of convincingly proportioned cartooning, is what I enjoy, and that kind of clear line, clean, designed approach. I particularly like Sleeping Beauty, actually, because I don't know if you're aware, but all the backgrounds in Sleeping Beauty were designed by a German painter, and the characters were animated to fit in with the background.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which at the time that the animators didn't like, because they preferred much rounder, squashier shapes. And if you look at all those drawings in Sleeping Beauty, they're kind of a bit more angular.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that style has gone on to influence some of the later Disney cartoons. I think like Aladdin have a much sharper, a much more straight-edged style to them. No, that's fascinating. But it's if when you first said Disney, I thought, nah, that can't be right. But the more I've thought about it, the more I see that in your art. It's quite remarkable.
And of course, you know, now we're talking on the subject of animation, or those Hanna-Barbera adventure cartoons, 1970s. I'm just trying to think of them off the top of my head.
It's got so many.
Johnny Quest. I never saw Johnny Quest. I'm not sure if Johnny Quest was broadcast here. Hanna-Barbera adventure cartoons that used to appear regularly in the end of the 60s through the early 70s.
I think there's things like Atamant and Space Ghost, things like that. Or are you thinking more the pure sort of adventure ones?
I'm thinking more the pure sort of adventure ones. Three Musketeers, that used to be part of the Banana Split show. Three Musketeers.
And the other things like they adapted Moby Dick and
they adapted Tarzan, didn't they? Star Trek,
right. That's interesting because, like I said, I would never have thought of that. But the second you said it, I thought, actually, I can see that ingrained into the way that you do your art. And that also seems to be the most consistent element of your art as well. That kind of clear line style. That uses thickness of line to denote depth and form, without any kind of extra additional shading.
Well, if it's done properly, and that of course is the element that's always sliding away from you as an artist. If it's done properly, if the forms are properly composed, the masses are properly composed within the panel, then you shouldn't need too much extra rendering and too much extra detailing for everything to look right. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your other work for 2000 AD. I mean, before I even knew what Zenith was, there was Maniac 5. That you developed with Mark Miller. And that's going from a fantastical superhero story, but one that's full of humans, into a very kind of action-packed robot story. Tell us a bit about how you came to be working with Mark on Maniac 5.
Well, Maniac 5 was part of the guest editorship that Mark and Grant did for 2000 AD, if I remember correctly. I think at the time I was going to be drawing The story that John Smith wrote, the name of which escapes me. But for whatever reason, they asked me to draw Maniac 5. Yeah, and you're right. There was a real energy to that writing. I believe Mark wrote it quite quickly. I think
better or for worse, I think.
as he described it to me, I think he'd already written something which at the last minute was turned down, and I think he wrote Maniac 5 in a raging fury, as Captain Hurricane used to have.
I love the idea of that. This will show them. Come on.
Yes, yeah. I don't know if you noticed. There's always an old man and a dog that appear in a lot of Miller strips at some point.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah. There's the opening scene in the opening few panels in, I think it's episode 2, with the old guy with his dog in the truck that gets crushed by one of the tripods. Right. I've noticed more than one old man and dog in a Mark Miller story cropping up somewhere.
I like it. Coded references all the way through his work. How did working on something like Maniac 5, which was really just pure kind of boys sci-fi action adventure, how did that differ to working on something like Zenith?
Well, the methodology didn't change. I still sort of read the scripts as carefully as I can, careful with the layouts, careful with the thumbnails. But it was just a much speedier, rushier kind of story. And I think that probably influenced my approach to the artwork. I kind of made some of it. I was looking at a lot of Katsuhiro Otomo, artist of Akira.
Yes, yeah.
At the time. And you can see it in the explosions.
And of course, that strip was coloured. You mentioned in the previous episode that doesn't really influence your the way that you do your artwork much.
No.
But I find it interesting that even though it doesn't, it still seems that you give a lot of room for colourists to breathe, as it were.
Yeah, I guess we're back to that those clear line influences on my work, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think as I said in our previous episode, I don't think I make allowances for the colourist when I'm drawing, but. I think in the same way, if you look at the work of Milton Caniff, that was, those Sundays were coloured. The Terry and the Pirates Sundays were coloured. But just as black and white work, as standalone black and white artwork, it kind of really stands up on its own without the colour.
Yeah.
And I maybe that was, I'm not sure, but maybe that was the philosophy of a lot of those guys in the 50s and 60s again. The artwork's got to stand on its own without the colour.
Now, I've skipped ahead a little bit, but actually that brings us nicely to another strip that you did with Mark Miller, which was Red Razors. Which certainly that first story that appeared in the Judge Dredd magazine fairly early on in its print run, that had so many things which I think have stayed with your career ever since the beginning of Zenith. You've got the pop culture references, which is a lot heavier in Mark's work than they were in Grant's work. Grant's were always a little bit more subtle, but Mark's is a bit more of a sledgehammer. But also it's a lot more visceral, a lot more violent. There's an almost kind of, I'd say, a pop art feel to it. That kind of slightly square, kind of futurist feel to the entire thing. Tell us a bit about Red Razors, and did you intentionally bring a different style to it?
I think if you look at Red Razors, I think the first episode is a slightly different style from subsequent ones, and I think it's much closer to the way I was drawing in Zenith Phase 3. And it kind of, once I started drawing it that way, I sort of realised it didn't really work. The techniques I was using for Zenith Phase 3 were appropriate for a kind of gothic horror come superhero story. They didn't work with Mark's kind of approach to red razors. So I started drawing with a lot of marker pens, and I started looking at a lot of, kind of got out of the old Bob Oxner Supergirl strips from the 60s. Those kind of lightweight is the wrong word, but those kind of inking styles, and I think those were a big influence on me for that particular project. Along, obviously filtered through all the other things that have got bolted on over the years.
Yeah, it really felt like Red Razors was a kind of response to Grant's, as I say, more subtle referencing of pop culture, but with Mark's trademark. What's the word I'm looking for?
Sledgehammer.
Sledgehammer. Yeah, I suppose I chose the right word the first time. Sledgehammer. Did you enjoy working on razors? It just felt that there was a lot more kind of kinetic energy to it.
Yes, I did. Yeah. It was quite a productive time for me as well. I think I seemed to be turning around the pages reasonably quickly. For whatever reason that was, I don't know. Maybe I was just been breathing in too much spray mount.
Well, I mean, looking at your bibliography, between sort of 89 through to about 94, 94, 96, that is an incredibly prolific period for you, because you're not just working at 2000 AD in the Joe Shed magazine, you're also doing stuff for America, such as Sebastian O and the Invisibles. Forgive me for asking, but how old were you around about that time?
Around, would we say 94, 96?
Yeah.
So 94, 96, I would have been 32, 34.
Okay,
yeah,
that's interesting. So that phase kind of covers your late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah,
I suppose by that point you're kind of confident enough in your abilities while still having a bit of youthful energy.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yes, yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there, Mike.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could produce pages at that rate now. I think that's something we will suffer from.
So one of the strips that you worked on was Devlin Waugh with John Smith, and you worked on it quite extensively. The original artist on that was Sean Phillips, and there's been one or two other artists that have also had a go. How did you come to be working on the strip in the first place?
It was simply I just got a phone call from David Bishop. I know they had obviously Chasing Herod was quite a long series.
Yeah.
And I had quite a good working relationship with David. And I think because they wanted someone to, or perhaps because they wanted someone to commit to, I think it was 18 months of drawing it.
Yeah, it's a biggie, isn't it?
Yeah, he got in touch with me, and I'd like to think I had a reputation for being reliable back then. So that's one of the reasons I'm sure David got in touch with me. And I was keen to work with John because I'd never worked with him before up till then.
As a series go on, you start to deadlines start to slip a little bit.
Yeah.
But David Bishop, you said, chose you because perhaps he felt that you were a reliable hand. How easy is it to as an artist to kind of maintain the pace on a long series, particularly when you've got something like Zenith or Red Seas or Devlin Waugh, where you're talking a long story, a lot of work? How do you keep up your stamina? How do you maintain the pace?
I've always done it, I think, by having a sort of fairly set ritual. A fairly set working day. You make sure you start at a certain time. I know roughly after all these years, I know roughly how long a given stage of a drawing a strip should take me.
Yeah.
So I know after so many days, I should be at this stage of the drawing.
Yeah.
And you break it down like that. I mean, you have a target each work day and then a target for the end of the week. And hopefully that will mean that you maintain a constant schedule, a consistent schedule.
Okay. You mentioned a little while ago about Sean Phillips having done pretty much all the groundwork in terms of design. But what I really note about your work on Devlin is how seemingly design-led it feels. You know, you kind of boil these characters down to their fundamental characteristics. So in many ways, I think Devlin looks almost more stylistic than he had under Sean's tenure.
Yeah, I guess that's just a byproduct of the way I draw. I could see the references to Terry Thomas Sean had made when he designed him.
Yeah.
If I remember, I think I probably hunted out some references of Terry Thomas, and because my style owes something more to that kind of 1950s, 1960s school of comics, and sort of classic Disney animation and that kind of thing, which is slightly more stylized than Sean's more illustrative approach. I guess that's how the changes came about.
You know, there's the Terry Thomas source there. There's you know, other stuff contained within Devlin's personality. How do you stop a character like that becoming a stereotype in of itself, a cipher, you know, two-dimensional?
Interesting. I've never really thought about that. I guess it's just, I mean, if you kind of, as part of the process, you've got to read the script pretty thoroughly anyway, so you get to know these characters quite intimately. I think perhaps, not saying like I'm talking out of my hat here, but in the same way that writers say that the characters talk to them while they're writing them, I guess in a way they must talk to you while you're drawing them.
Right.
And they'd kind of tell you if you were doing the wrong thing. You know, you develop an instinct for what they would and wouldn't do, and what they would and wouldn't like you to have them do.
Yeah. Well, so I suppose that's the way to make a whole character. Really, is to feel the character.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And like I say, that comes back to reading the script thoroughly and kind of immersing yourself in the story. I mean, I like to read the script through 3 or 4 times before I sit down and start thumbnailing out the panel layouts. So by that point, I'm pretty familiar with what's got to happen over the course of that episode.
With Chasing Herod and Sirius Rising, rereading it, it seems to act as a kind of bridge between your kind of Zenith phase and your later stuff on things like Red Seas and Black Shock and DeMarco. Where for you does it sit in that spectrum? Was it a time where you were still developing as an artist, or when you were kind of getting into full throttle?
Styles are a funny thing, really. I don't think you ever sit down and think, well, today I'm going to change my style. So what I've always found tends to happen is you can come up with a particular methodology or a particular approach that works very well for you over a period of time, and then for whatever reason it doesn't start giving you the same results, in which case you kind of have to sort of step back from the whole thing and think, well, you know, those brush lines aren't working, maybe I should use a pen, or those pen lines aren't working, maybe I should use a marker, and kind of introduce something new into the process, and that kind of freshens you up, and then restarts that journey forward. And I think that's probably where these little changes in style come from. It's one of the pressures, obviously, of producing so many pages a month, year in, year out. I mean, Dave Gibbons, I remember saying once in an interview, it was very hard to maintain the same style over a series, probably for those very same reasons I've just chatted with you about.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting on the longer epics, seeing how people change. We'll talk about Zenith in depth, but the difference in your style between phase 1 and phase 4 is quite pronounced. But even something like Bisley on the Horn God, there is a clear, palpable, demonstrable change between the first page and the last page, and whether it's him getting quicker, whether it's him running out of time, whether it's him improving, whatever it is, you see the evolution on the page.
Yes, yeah, that's it. I kind of always find there's a stage in a series as well, maybe comes around the halfway point, 2/3 of the way in, where you really do hit that brick wall, and you've kind of really got to grit your teeth, and then you kind of just batter your way through that hurdle, and hopefully finish on a high.
Yeah.
I'm sure writers have the same problem.
Well, it comes back to that kind of stamina question I asked. It's like a marathon runner.
Yeah.
You can sprint the first few miles, but you'll soon run out of puff. So you've got to pace yourself over the course.
That's it, exactly. Very good analogy, Mike.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm thinking about the kind of the hitting the brick wall. When you're 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, and you realise how far you've come, but still how much further you've got to go. Has there ever been a time when you've been dispirited, where you have got to that point and thought, where am I going to go with this?
Yeah, not these days. I mean, I may have felt a bit like that when I first started out drawing comics, and I can remember. Well, probably at some point in the first Zenith series, because the deadline pressures felt so great.
Yeah,
I was going out for walks in the evening just to kind of clear my head, and you do think, "Good grief, can I get through this? Can I maintain turning in episodes every 11 days? I had to turn in that first Zenith series,
right?
But it's just with experience, you just kind of get used to it.
Yeah.
I think John Burns said in an interview one time that how, as he was older, deadlines didn't seem as real in a way to him as they did when he was younger.
Yeah.
But I think that's just the experience thing.
We've spoken at length about your collaboration on Zenith with Grant. You have been remarkably blessed with collaborators, particularly at 2000 AD. What's it been like to see how that group of you, who all roughly started around about the same time, have gone on to various things?
It's been great. It's been really nice to see. I mean, it's great for Mark that he's as well, now is he big in films? He's done a lot of work.
I think he has a size in films. Yeah,
he has a size in films. Yes, it's great that he has a size in films now. It's nice to see people kind of taking comics and jumping off into other things. And same for Grant. I mean, Grant's got some. I think he's pretty much a permanent fixture at DC now, isn't he, Grant?
Yes,
It's nice to see him being such an important part of the setup there.
One thing, the reason I ask is because there's one thing that you did work on with Grant for Crisis, which was the New Adventures of Hitler.
Yeah.
For those who are listening who don't know about the New Adventures of Hitler, describe it in a few words.
Hitler visits his in-laws in Liverpool in the early part of the 20th century. Yeah, it's based on a book called the Memoirs of Bridget Hitler, written by the aforesaid Bridget Hitler.
Yeah,
who was married to Hitler's, I think it's half-brother, married to Hitler's half-brother, Alois, spelled Alois. I'm not entirely sure how that's pronounced.
Yeah.
And they were living in Liverpool around about 1912, and she claims that Hitler, possibly avoiding the draft in the Austrian army, came to visit them.
I love the fact that Grant saw that and thought, that's a good idea for a comedy strip.
Yeah. You wouldn't think there was that much potential, would you?
No. I mean, what was it like working on something that was essentially out and out comedy?
Yeah, it was pretty surreal bonkersness.
Yeah.
It was nice that Nick Abadzis and Steve Whittaker got to colour it, because they brought it to a whole new level of surreal imagery. With some of that, I don't know if you noticed, some of it is some of that colouring is actually montage in the blue lines, and it brought a whole new dimension to it, to that wackiness. I tried to approach it in a slightly more cinematic way than I felt was more cinematic than I had done previously. Kind of rather than having cause and effect and action and reaction in the one panel, kind of cut away and cut to reactions. And I kept the layouts very formal. I used that 6-panel 2x3 grid quite a lot, which seemed to suit the pacing of the story much more as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've talked about the kind of influence of pop culture on Grant and Mark's writing, and I mean, case in point, Crisis was the apex of comics and pop culture, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, especially getting Ryan to do the styling on it. That was very much a pop culture statement. Yeah.
Coming back to 2000 AD, you've done a smattering of Judge Dredd over the years. You've only done a couple of Future Shocks, but it just feels like whenever you've been off to do stuff for places like DC and Vertigo, 2000 AD has always been that constant. In your life. What does it mean to you, not necessarily as an artist, but just as somebody who needs work, to always have that kind of home to go back to?
Oh, well, it's great. I mean, it's wonderful that they are so willing to keep me employed after all these years. Yeah, it's just lovely to have. It's that whole 2000 AD attitude and ethos and all embracing approach to writing styles and art styles. It's always nice to come home to. I'm meeting up with another old friend.
So many old friends. Oh, you use the word ethos there. If it's not too kind of woolly and vague, what is your ethos about the way that you work? And the kind of art that you produce, is there a central idea about what it is you want to achieve?
Well, what I want to achieve is, I owe it to the reader to make the story as clear as possible, and I owe it to the writer to follow to interpret their vision, if you like. If that doesn't sound too woolly and vague, as closely as possible. I mean, in a lot of ways, as a comics artist, you are the intermediary between the writer and the reader, and it's a big responsibility, and you kind of have to be aware of these two parties when you're drawing these pages. You can't be too self-indulgent about the whole thing.
I mean, that's an interesting take on it. It's self-indulgent, because there are some artists who are guilty of that, of kind of I suppose in a way grandstanding, kind of showing off on the page. But really, the best comics are where the writer and artist are in sync with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have there been times in your career? I mean, I guess the most obvious one is Zenith, but other times in Zenith where you've really felt that kind of energy between you and the writer in terms of your collaboration?
You mean other times other than Zenith? Or?
Yes, other than Zenith, yeah.
Yeah, I've always got on really well with all the writers I've worked with. Strange enough, and they all have their own little ways of working, their own little foibles. Their scripts always feel, slightly different from each other.
Yeah.
I mean, some can be far more descriptive in their panel descriptions. Morrison's panel descriptions are always kind of, they're like little bits of literature, really. They sort of created an impression of what was wanted rather than nailing you down too closely. Someone like Steve Moore
Oh, yeah.
had a very not descriptive, not in a bad way, of writing of his in his panel descriptions. It was very much, so and so is standing on the left, and who the other character's standing on the right, and they're doing this and that and the other. It was just a different way of doing it. But I've always got on well with my writers. I guess I'm just lucky.
Well, I mean, just a cursory glance at the list of stuff you've done for 2000 AD alone. You've got Neil Gaiman as your, not the first published work, but certainly the first that you drew for 2000 AD, which was a Future Shock, and then straight in with Grant on Zoids, not Zoids, on Zenith, and you've got Mark Miller, Steve Moore. Like I said, you've done a smattering of Judge Dredd with like Wagner and Grant and Mark,
and of course the saintly Ian Edgington.
Yes, absolutely. Well, what better time to talk about it than Red Seas, the epic Red Seas, which is there aren't that many stories, I think, at 2000 AD that deserve the word epic. Not necessarily because they're great. You can talk about the sort of the mega epics for Judge Dredd and things like that, but where there's an epic story being told, and you get things like Nikolai Dante, which deserves it. But also, I think Red Seas deserves to be called an epic because it's a vast body of work. How we talked last week about standing the pace on these things. How was it on Red Seas to keep a certain constancy all the way through those big, long, epic stories?
Well, there was always really Red Seas is a series of 12, 14 episode stories, which collectively make up the whole epic, and that each of them were different enough to just give you that renewed burst of energy every time you started a new story.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, Ian's a great character writer, a great dialogue writer. Actually, we kind of don't really talk about. Well, perhaps people do talk about how important the dialogue is to the comics writing. And I've always got, as an artist, I've probably got far more out of the dialogue than I have out of the panel descriptions, really. Just as an aside. But Ian and I both share a love of kind of B-movie kind of things, Ray Harryhausen, Roger Corman, and you can see all those influences popping up all the time in Red Seas. Plus, I mean, I really enjoy a good costume drama myself. So to get to draw that kind of thing for 10 years, was it? How many years did you draw Red Seas for?
Good God. It started in Prague 1313 and ended in 2008. Good God, it was 11 years. That's 11 years of work.
Yeah, I remember there are little bits and pieces in between.
Yeah,
so it's not 11 years straight through.
But even so, just I mean that's a vast body of work.
It is actually, yeah. And we were Ian and I were saying when you brought out the digital edition of the collected Red Seas. You forget just just how big a body of work it was.
Yeah.
But to sort of spend that amount of time with those characters, with a writer of Ian's caliber, is a pleasure. What better job can it be? You're staying in out of the rain, There's no heavy lifting, and you get to draw pirates all day. What could be better than that?
It seemed that your style kind of responded to the subject matter, became a lot more open, a lot starker, because you've got you started using spot blacks in a very different way. So a lot of the panels, particularly the huge, great big vistas, the double page spreads that you did, the amount of detail is less, but you seem to be doing more with less. Was that a conscious thing?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how conscious it is. I know exactly what you're saying, and I can see it myself. I think that it's kind of that approach has probably sneaked up on me over the years. With, as I was saying last week, with that having to take a step backwards in order to take a few more steps forwards with your artwork. And I think all these things have gradually sneaked up on me over the years. But, without sounding too pompous, that, the art is in what you leave out, not what you put in.
Right.
And yeah, I've talked myself into a corner with that.
Wait, I find it a contrast between your work on something like Detonator X, where it's essentially Pacific Rim. You've got these big robots duking it out, and I wasn't 100% convinced that more kind of open style seemed to suit that. But then you get something like Red Seas, where you kind of go, well, you're talking about open seas, you're talking about gods walking amongst man, and it really seemed to gel in a way that it hadn't before.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. I can't quite explain that. I guess we're back to those classic B influences, aren't we? 60s comics, B movies, Disney animation. It's all in the mix there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I like drawing a big broad horizon, a kind of a monument valley. I could draw monument valley all day. In terms of because you've been drawing DeMarco for the Judge Dredd magazine recently about a former judge turned private investigator. Are you comfortable in the more claustrophobic world of Megacity 1? Yes, I haven't had any claustrophobic moments myself so far. Yeah, me and Mike seem to be chugging along quite happily. And he writes some delightful scripts, and I'm enjoying drawing them.
Because it's often the reason I ask is it's often clear that some artists favour more natural environments over more constructed environments like Megacity 1. So for the Judge Dredd Mega Collection, I was recently talking to John Ridgway, and despite having been known for his, in many ways known for his Judge Dredd work alongside Luke Kirby, he said, well, I don't really like Megacity 1. And if you look carefully, all my stories are where he leaves Megacity 1. They're all in the Cursed Earth.
Yeah.
I looked at his stuff and I went, yeah. I hadn't noticed it was the connecting factor in all of it is when they go outside. So I just wanted to see whether there was an environment in which you felt more comfortable as an artist.
Yeah, I suppose I guess my environments are always more organic-y, but my approach to science fiction is very much in that same mould as Carlos draws, in so much everything looks like it's based around organic shapes.
Yeah,
I don't know if you noticed in a lot of Carlos's strips, there's no straight lines. Everything's curves. Everything's based on sort of seed pods and printed circuits, and it's kind of organic-y and soft lines.
Yeah.
And my kind of science fiction is nearer to that than it is to that sort of that hard-edged science fiction. I think.
I'm pretty sure Carlos said it at his panel in San Diego that was on a previous episode that he sees Mega City 1 not as buildings rising up, but mushrooms growing.
Yeah.
And of course that has influenced everybody from Mick McMahon through to people working now. Is this idea that's completely overgrown?
Yeah, and I think and there's probably little elements of Mike McMahon in my Mega City, and I think I'm right in saying if you look at the style of Mike McMahon's buildings, they're kind of they're topped off in the same kind of shapes as people's hats.
Yes,
there's a style of headgear people have in Mega City 1.
Yeah,
and you can see that mirrored in his building designs.
Yeah.
Which I've tried to do myself. I mean, I think people have picked me up on it. Perhaps it's a bit too obvious.
Well, let's talk about a couple of I suppose in a way curios in your career. One of them is the adaptation of A Life Less Ordinary. That was in the 2000 AD in 1997, an adaptation of the Danny Boyle film. Not often those kind of things come along. Ever since sort of the death of the comic book adaptation of films that I regularly used to see sort of crop up on the shelves in newsagents. What was it like working on that, where you actually have a work of art that you are just adapting for another medium?
It wasn't wildly different from working on any comic strip. Obviously, the responsibility for translating the film treatment into script form was Dave Bishop's, and I, and he wrote a straightforward, structurally straightforward a comic story. We didn't have the copyright to use the likenesses of Ewan McGregor and Cameron Diaz, which is why they don't really look like Ewan McGregor and Cameron Diaz.
Right.
And I found, I think my first idea was to try and make the camera angles similar to the things that Danny Boyle had used, but I quickly realised that was impractical. And I kind of settled on this idea of making it look sort of like Love and Rockets,
Right.
Jaime Hernandez style, but obviously coloured. It was a fun project to do. It was different. It came about almost by accident because Lifeless Limited, who were the production company for A Lifeless Ordinary, got in touch with the office asking how to go about getting a comic strip produced for A Lifeless Ordinary. At which point, I think Steve Mack was still working there at the time. And Steve and Dave said, "Well, we can do that for you. we'll run it in the magazine." Yeah.
It's something that we as a comic have not done very often, and there's been varying degrees of success. So we had Life Less Ordinary, and there was the Simon Pegg, Shaun of the Dead one-off strip that Fraser Irving drew. When that was at its height. But it's interesting that Steve and David decided on going with you. Was this something that they thought, well, this is perfect for Steve, or was it just that you were looking for work at the time?
I don't remember that I was looking for work at the time. I think they just wanted someone they'd worked with, because it was all quite short notice.
Right.
I think they kind of just wanted to touch base with someone they'd worked with before. That they felt was I'd like to think that I was reliable.
Yeah.
I think it was just as purely as practical as that.
Okay. You also worked with the late Steve Moore on Red Fang, which I described this in Life Less Ordinary as curios, but that's not quite the right word. They're more just kind of strips that never felt as if they fitted into preordained slots that 2000 AD had, and with Red Fang, you seem to be able to really indulge in that kind of slightly Disney-esque, everything very rounded feel to it. Tell us a bit about that strip and working with Steve. I mean, he was one of the giants of British comics.
Yeah, it was interesting. When Steve, was very knowledgeable on Chinese history, Chinese mythology, and that was that made itself felt when I was turning in the first few character designs to him, because he didn't want characters to have not ponytails, sort of plaited ponytails at the back, which is the classic Western stereotype of Chinaman. And that was my bad for doing a stereotype. But he pointed all these mistakes out, and he was very big on making sure that the Chinese culture is reflected properly through the strip. It was I hesitate to say traditional, but it was more of a sort of space opera kind of a story, rather than it wasn't dystopian. Let's put it like that.
Right.
It was his own sort of unique, self-contained universe, wasn't it? If that makes sense.
Well, the reason I bring it up really is because it seems very much that your style, with its economy of line and its adaptability, is able to suit so many different kinds of strip. So over the course of these two episodes, we've talked about superheroes, we've talked about pirates, we've talked about science fiction, we've talked about dystopia, we've got a martial arts kind of mythological series, we've had a film adaptation, we've had straight sci-fi action adventure with robots with human brains in them. There aren't that many artists who, even at 2000 AD, who can claim to have a style that suits all of those things. So what do you think it is about the way that you work, the way that you approach your artwork, that means you're able to adapt to all these different things?
Well, I think we're going back to those classic influences again, aren't we?
Right, yeah.
Because back in the day, the 50s, 60s, 70s, you were expected to be adaptable. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of some of the varied projects that an artist like, let's say, Jeff Campion drew. I mean, he drew westerns, didn't he? He drew science fiction, he drew war comics. He did everything.
Yeah.
And all those guys could. But it was expected of them, and I guess because I'm as influenced by that period as I am, that I'm able to, look at these diverse projects, and not think, oh.
Well, I think your work sort of sits as a kind of a bridge between, as we've talked about, that kind of older generation who were expected to do all of those things and be adaptable, and the new style of comics, which is full of its pop culture references and its more violent action and stuff like that. Do you feel, I don't know, what's the word? Privileged, happy, comfortable to kind of sit between those two different eras?
Yes, I have no problem with that at all. If I can straddle those two eras, then that suits me. It's a great place to be.
Yeah, and I suppose it speaks to 2000 AD's place in comics that you can do all those different things in one place. We kind of people. I mean, we even describe ourselves as a sci-fi action comic, but it's so much more in there, all under the same roof.
Yes, it's long since ceased to be a science fiction comic, really, hasn't it? It's kind of science fantasy. Is that a more encompassing phrase? Science
fantasy, historical
horror.
Whatever you want to do, basically.
Whatever you want to do. I don't know. There must be a phrase for it. There must be a genre
anthology, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, you referenced the freedom a little while ago, staying at 2000 AD, being able to do the kind of things that you want to do. Looking to the future, is there first off, is there something that you've not done that you would like to do in the future? Is there something you would like to do more of? Where, after this career that's spanned 30 years, where do you go now?
Well, I've never done a love story.
Okay.
I've never really done a war story as such. I've never really done a traditional space opera, space rockets and plastic bubble helmets kind of a story.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there's dozens of things I haven't done that I'm sort of very open to suggestions. If any of these, if any projects come through like this, come Mighty Tharg's way.
I can hear Ian Edgington's brain whirring as he's listening to this. Just, right, what can I do?
Well, I know Ian's brain is whirring at the moment. I was speaking to him only yesterday.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I mean, look into the future. Where do you see your career go from here?
Well, more of the same, I hope.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, as long as I'm enjoying what I'm doing, I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing.
Has the publication of the Apex edition and the fact that Zenith was out of print for so long, has this been a period over the last year or so where you have, naturally just kind of looked back and thought about where you've come from, where you've been, what you've done?
It's starting to.
Right.
I haven't got quite that far yet. I've been too busy, writing little notes for you for the Apex edition. No, I don't like to look back too closely. I mean, you should be looking forward all the time as a creative person anyway, shouldn't you?
You've worked with some amazing writers.
Mm-hmm.
You've worked on some amazing characters. What for you have been the absolute highlights of the last 30 years?
To be honest, there's an absolute highlight at some point in every story you do. Obviously, I'm very fond of Zenith, because that's the character I'm most associated with, and he's been very good to me. But seriously, there's you can't separate out one project as having more highlights than the other, because there's always there's always a highlight in the story at some point. I'm sort of waffling now.
No. It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. Because I guess the reason I ask is that people's careers naturally rise and fall, and have their ups and downs. And I think is there the case that after a certain point you have to find a highlight in whatever you're doing, otherwise it can become routine and dull?
Yeah, but as long as you're prepared to be open to new things, and as a creative person, be prepared to look beyond the boundaries of your particular medium, if you like. Yeah. I mean, this last year or so, I've been looking at a lot of going to a lot of. There's a website called Muddy Colours, which is a fantasy art collective, and these guys they're all painters. They're all painters, acrylic painters, digital painters, which isn't what I do at all.
Yeah.
And I also read James Gurney's blog quite a lot. James Gurney's artist and writer of Dinotopia, and he's very, very knowledgeable on the traditional atelier schools of the 19th century. Those very academic painting approaches that they used. 19th, end of the 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah.
But there's always rich seams to be mined if you're prepared to look around for them. And the point is to be open to all these things and to be receptive to all these things. And as a creative person yourself, use these things to grow, for your own work to grow, to take your own work in along down that line.
Because you're still a traditional medium artist, aren't you? There's aside from the scanning, there's no kind of digital manipulation.
Yeah, well, there's little bits of digital cleaning up.
Right.
What I don't like to do is clean up everything on the page. I like to leave little bits of line work where I've gone over the lines. I sort of leave in, otherwise you end up doing what Cosgrove Hall did when they did, I can't remember which movie it was, but they used 3D animation rather than their stop motion puppets, and everything was so clean and so refined, it kind of almost lost a little bit of the character. But so the digital is gradually working its way more and more into my methodology, into my workflow. I think Mike McMahon at the moment uses this strange halfway house between digital and analog.
Right.
And that he'll work up a drawing so far in pencil, then scan it in, and he'll ink stuff in marker pen and scan that in, and drop the solid blacks in on the computer. All strange little things like that. And I'm starting to drift a bit more that way myself. You have to do these things just so you've got more tools in the arsenal.
Yeah. No, it's interesting still how many of our artists still work traditionally. But then we have obviously the people who are purely digital. But as you say, the still many more are in that kind of halfway house where they feel that they've got the best of both worlds. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I bring you back to Mike McMahon.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's one of the nice things about the Apex edition, really, is it's not casting any aspersions, but seeing the imperfections in many ways. The editor's marks and the speech bubbles that have dropped off, or the edges of panels that aren't look straight when they're reduced down, but then you see them and you say, well, that is a physical brush that has been used to create an imperfect line that still looks great. So I kind of guess it's all about character, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I was looking through one of Phil Winslade's sketchbooks he had with him a short while back, and he had these really scratchy, hyper detailed Phil Winslade's drawings, but there's whiteout all over them.
Yeah.
But it looked great. It was like an integral part of the image. After all, erasing is part of drawing, as someone said.
Absolutely. Right. Well, Steve, thank you for taking the time to talk to us on the Thrillcast. I really appreciate it.
Very welcome, Mike.
It's been a fascinating insight into your artwork has been with me ever since I started reading 2000 AD, and I think that's the case for many people. So thank you for talking to us, and thank you for some great moments in 2000 AD.
You're very welcome, and thanks for those kind words, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Brilliant.
Alert! Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.